So there are lots of questions around the table. Uh, Perhaps I might just set the ball rolling by asking, you talk about the 50s and the 60s, particularly the linkages with mainstream political parties. Of course, the Congress is very dominant with B.C. Roy as the chief minister. But the left is emerging, and left is beginning to make its presence felt both in electoral terms and in street politics in Calcutta. And in both those spheres, the refugees who are in Calcutta, homeless, or this whole idea of dispersal of refugees, also there is a polarization. There is a strong group which does not want them to be sent out of Bengal. So the linkages between the left movement and the refugees in that period seems a bit complex, um, in terms of the left providing the kind of power to the number of people who could actually bring Calcutta to a standstill, and the communists use that sort of those people. So on the one hand, there is this resource which is available to the communists to display their power in electoral terms and in terms of what is happening on the street. But on the other hand, there is this, why is it that they do not really, what happens in terms of elections? Do these people get registered? Do they become voters of the Communist Party? Where is the communist strength coming from, say in 62 and 67, when clearly it is on the upswing? So that's one question. And then second question is really about Jogendranath Mandal, who, being such an important person in the 40s and who occupied important positions in government before partition and then in Pakistan, how is it that he is not able to make a headway with mainstream parties? Isn't he somebody who would be useful in electoral terms to say the Congress? Yeah.
He was Muslim League.
He was a Muslim League, but after 1950, he came back to Calcutta.
Came back to Congress, but he didn't have the Congress base because
he did not have that.
Originally a Muslim leaguer.
But he was still seen as he was a Muslim leaguer briefly, but he was a leader of the Dalits, in a sense, isn't it? A Nam Shudra leader. So that is his primary identity and affiliation.
Incidentally, he was the first Pakistan minister for Kashmir affairs as well.
Yes, and education. Yes, your first question is that communist participation in this whole refugee politics, when I studied the papers, I was most frustrated to see their role. I mean, this is a role of duplicity of an extent that no one can imagine. The refugees, the United Central Refugee Council, the UCRC, was dominated around by 1950 by the communist leaders. And they had a significant following among the refugees. And they were the first to mobilize the refugees in the first wave. And even after 1950, those were the leaders, the communist leaders were the leaders who would go to the refugee camps, and they would work, and some of them would live in the refugee camps, and the refugees had reposed a lot of faith in the communist leadership. And this was the 1950, and then came the 1952 election. And by the time of the 1952 election, the Communist Party found that these people were not registered voters. So they are not going to make any change. So they kind of played it under. So they were not any more interested to play their cards and with the refugees. Then the election went. They had a very spectacular result. The CPI had a spectacular result in West Bengal in 1952, and one of the major constituents were the first-time refugees in and around Calcutta, who had by that time registered themselves as voters. Then from around 53, 54, they again come back to the camps. And there are a number of communist leaders who are very active in the communist, in the leadership, in the refugee camps. There are two things happening. The first thing was that the communist leadership was from the very beginning underplaying the caste question, which is understandable from their perspective. but they were also not supporting a grassroots level leadership coming up. And at this stage, we now have a number of grassroots level leadership coming up from the camps. One or two were being inducted in their Politburo, in their higher committees, but within a year or so, they were so disgusted and so discouraged by this whole situation that they were coming up. And we have two major leaders from the camps who were completely kind of disavowing their earlier communist allegiance, and we have police records on them, and the interrogation reports which the police officers argue, and from there also we find their major argument was that the Communist Party was playing with the refugees. They were not really interested in doing something concrete for the refugees. The refugees were for them only the fodder for the election campaign. The other second major point was, there was, as we mentioned, there was a major conflict of interest. Most of the communist leaders who were working in the refugee front, they were also leaders of the Kisan Sabha. And there were a number of incidents that were taking place in the mid-1950s where these refugees were on their own going out of the camp and taking over Westland from the local peasants. And this created on a number of occasions open conflict between the refugee peasants and the resident peasants. And these resident peasants were the constituency of the Kisan Sabhas and the Communist Party. So this was a major kind of conflict of interest which they worked on. But they really kind of withdrew from the refugee front in the late 1950s because of two reasons. The first and foremost was the food movement. In the 1950s, the food movement starts, and the Communist Party is hugely involved in this food movement. And the Communist Party wants the refugee movement to become a part of the food movement. And we have reports, the police reports of an open confrontation in a public meeting where the UCRC, the communist leaders of the UCRC coming to the public meeting in the Cooper's campus. And they were saying that the food movement is a major movement and the refugees should become part of this. And then a local refugee leader comes on this dais and he says, yes, we will support the food movement, but these communist leaders must remember that our problem is not just food. Our problem is about our entire existence. So do not just conflate our movement, our struggle with the food movement. And that was, I think, another major clash of interest, where this communist leadership was coming out of withdrawing from the refugee movement. And as a result, Jogen Mandal, who was operating with the communists at one stage, comes out of the he disavows communist connection. He starts his own political party, East India Refugee Council, and starts organizing the refugee movement on his own. It's an autonomous movement. But that does not go anywhere, because all the mainstream political parties have kind of abandoned. So Communist Party was looking refugees as another constituency to be mobilized for electoral purposes, and these refugees were becoming increasingly kind of disheartened. But once again, after the 60s, which I did not go into, the late 60s, they're once again coming back because there was no other alternative, because everyone else, the Congress was even worse. So that's where the refugees becomes once again supporters of the CPIM when it becomes active. Jogen Mandal had crossed the line in the partition by going over to the Muslim League. And that was something which the mainstream political leaders in West Bengal never forgot. And when he comes back after 1950, he was the only leader of this previous colonial period Dalit movement who never again had an electoral victory. He's tried in 3 elections. In all the 3 elections, he was defeated by people who no one knew about them. So in other words, and no and neither Congress nor Communist Party, none of the mainstream political parties would give him a ticket, because they just, sorry? He contested as assembly election, yes. And no mainstream political party would accept him, would give him a ticket. Because, and by the mid-1950s, he is openly anti-establishment. And so neither Congress, nor CPI, nor PSP, no one would touch him. So he had, by this time, developed a kind of essential anti-establishment politician who no other mainstream political party would touch. And without a mainstream political party ticket, he would not win an election.
Thank you. Prof. Dwyer.
I'm sorry, I have to leave, so I want to ask this. It's a fascinating stuff. I wonder if you've been in touch with Partha Chatterjee recently.
Not in touch with him recently.
Okay, because he gave a talk here about 3 months ago, and I brought up your work to him. His talk was about the Bengali political class in contemporary West Bengal, in modern West Bengal. And he's trying to make quite a romantic argument, I think, which is to say that why is it that they don't bring up caste issues in Bengal politics? It's exceptional in not having caste politics. And his argument was that a lot of them are from East Bengal, and that they lost, they didn't have property, they don't have landed property, so they're not tied to the whole rural system, and they have education, and they, so that's why. So there is an initial condition which you are talking about, which I think he should become even more aware of, because I had seen your earlier work, so I had sort of tried to tell him, but he could then say, that was, but this is an ongoing thing, that it's based on the dispersal of these, of the caste factor rather than anything else. One other small, I think it'd be very good if you got in touch or gave a paper in his center or something.
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
Yes.
So the other thing I have several questions, but I'll just ask one other thing. I'm a little puzzled by what you say about, because your earlier works suggest about caste politics, about the integration into the political sphere or the identity issue. I know you're making a distinction between Namashudra and Dalits, but the Namashudra seems to be, you had argued that they constituted a sufficient vote bank of 50 million to elect Mamata. So, they are behaving as a political identity and so on. So how do you square those?
This is, yeah. Just briefly comment on Partha Chatterjee. Yes, I know Parthoda's position, and I have a major dispute with him. And I understand both of us have written chapters in a book which is soon coming out, where both of us take two very different positions. So I'm still waiting. This is on caste, class, and politics in West Bengal, something like that. Rutledge is bringing out the book. So he has. I have problem with his position that it's because he does not take into account the whole colonial story of discrimination that was not even overt, that was very, very covert, and he does not take that into account. And he just explained it in that way, which is I find very problematic, and we had discussion on that. But about the other point, which, as I said, as I mentioned at the very outset, that this has ramifications for the later period, the contemporary period. This happens from the 1970s. This is what I tried to see, that when these people lost the physical space, they began to create an imagined space, and this was mainly a spiritual space, through a spiritual movement called the Matua movement, the Matua Mahasangha. And the P.R. Thakur, who was disillusioned with all the mainstream political parties, from 1976, he started organizing this movement, which was entirely, to start with, entirely non-political. And its main purpose was to connect this dispersed community across India into a kind of movement. And
Not the other Bengali Dalits.
yes, it was initially the refugee focused, but then it became very open-ended. It was kind of open to all Dalit communities in the province.
And Mamata.
That Mamata factor comes at a very later stage. And Mamata factors has ruined this organization. It is now divided over the last few years. It is now divided. The family is divided. The two sons were fighting each other. The movement is split. The this whole intervention of Mamata has destroyed this movement. And that was what I predicted in my book, if you look at carefully, that this was bound to happen.
Okay. We have Prof. Mitra.
I've got three rather political scientist questions. First, as far as I know, Dalit as a category of analysis is a recent category. So how legitimate is it to apply it to the history of the late 40s, early 50s? My second question is about refugees and what we could infer from the politics they left behind. I mean, take the case of someone like Jogen Mondal. If I were engaged in the business of party building, Mondal would be a great recruit for politics at the lowest level, and he would grow as he gets bigger. The fact that he stayed back and could not be retained within the ranks of the Muslim League tells us something about the nature of party building and governance in East Pakistan. Now, I would like to know why he was allowed to leave or what made him leave. My third question is, and this is a disturbing one, the voice that comes across your entire talk is that of victimhood. Now, victimhood as a category of analysis, that look at us, how badly we are treated, feel sorry for us. As a political scientist, I would rather think in terms of political capital. If these people, first of all, they had number, they had bodies, they had political acumen, and they had a nuisance value, why could they not get more out of this political capital? And for that, we need to compare their politics with the politics of the equivalents of Dalits from the Western Front. Now, were there Dalit equivalents also in West Pakistan? Did they migrate? Did they stay back? What happened to those who migrated to India in terms of their post-partition politics? Or in other words, can we compare your story to the comparable story on the Western Front, and what could we then generalize in terms of political consequences of initial political capital?
Okay. About Dalit as a category, let me say at the very beginning, yes, I agree that Dalit as this terminology was not used in the colonial period in Bengal. It was being used from the 1930s. I think it was from around 1935. It was being used in Western India and Northern India, and not so much in Bengal. But I use the term here, even in the historical sense, in the absence of any other appropriate term. Because the other appropriate terminology would have been either scheduled caste or depressed classes or Harijan, to identify all these various kinds of groups who are politically grouped together for political action. And each of these terms has its own baggage. And I think the term Dalit, although it's of recent vintage, I mean, I think it can possibly historically used because the objective condition within which the term was coined was still prevalent in the condition which I am dealing with. So I'm kind of putting it retrospectively onto the history, which I agree. Why Mondal had to migrate? I mean, this was in connection with the 1950s situation in East Pakistan. And when he actually migrated, I mean, the story of migration is very significant. I interviewed Mondal's son, and what Mondal's son told us is that there was a threat, death threat to him, so he practically fled from West Pakistan into India, telling that his son was ill, and so he just took off. Before he took off, he wrote an 8,000 words letter of resignation. And that resignation letter has been published and widely used, where he argues that he had joined the Muslim League and remained in East Pakistan because he believed in Jinnah's promise that in Pakistan there would be no discrimination between religion and caste and so on. Everyone would be equal citizen. And he argues that after Jinnah's death, everyone forgot that promise. And so he says that when this was happening and when the riot started in 1950, he went himself to the riot-torn areas. And he himself, being minister, was threatened. So he argues that when a minister can be threatened, this is no longer the place I can live. So he leaves over. So from his perspective, that is the major point which he makes in his letter of resignation, which is a historic document which has been used for various purposes. That letter has been used by the Hindu fundamentalists, by the secularists, for all kinds of political purposes. That letter has been used. About the political capital and the comparison with the Western Front, that is a very important question. And about the Punjab refugees, we have Ravinder Kaur's work, who looks at the Dalit refugees who came from Punjab to the Delhi region, where she shows that the Dalit refugees from Punjab were not treated as good as the other refugees from Punjab, but nevertheless, they got rehabilitation. And the rehabilitation within the areas, within UP, Delhi, and other areas, they did not have to go to a God-forsaken place like Dandakaran. So in other words, the whole argument is they got a much better deal. Although within the Punjab context, they did not get as good a deal as the other upper caste professional or migrants. But nevertheless, they did not have to suffer as much as the Bengali refugees suffered, particularly the refugees who came after 1950. Because the first and foremost, they were not treated as partition refugees. For Government of India, partition story had ended. So they were treated as unwanted economic refugees, and Nehru's position, Nehru was writing again and again to B.C. Roy that this stream must stop, otherwise Indian economy will be in jeopardy. So they will completely, not only West Bengal's economy would be ruined, the Indian economy would be set out of balance. So this must stop. But this was not stopping. So in other words, but I do not completely, maybe if I had time, in fact, when we write the book, we will bring out the other thing. This is a story of victimhood, but it is not entirely a story of victimhood. This is also a story of agency. What really impressed us, the way they organized the resistance movements. I mean, this were a group of people who had practically nothing. All the political parties had abandoned him. Both the states of Pakistan and India had abandoned him. Even within that condition, they were organizing themselves for protest. And when they went to Dandakaran, That is the next part of the story, which we are not going into this work. That is how they ultimately did in Dandakaranya. If you go to Dandakaranya today, many of them are very, very well settled. But they still nurture that scar, that West Bengal abandoned them. And what they also lament, that their children do not speak Bengali anymore. They have become Hindi speakers, so they have lost their identity. And that was the major other incident was the Marichapi massacre of 1978. When the CPM came back, CPM was telling them that they will bring them back from Dandakaranya, but when CPM came to power, several thousands came back and settled down in the Marichapi area in Sundarban, and the West Bengal, the CPM government simply massacred them and sent them back. That's the other scar. But that's the second part of our story, which we are stopping at 64.
Some more questions. So Rananjay, Ambassador Chaudhary, and then Sojan after that.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of push, you on the question that Pushenjit raised about the absence of caste in West Bengal politics. And the interesting thing is now, if you look at the numbers of, to use the government, the scheduled caste category, West Bengal has one of the highest, in terms of the SC population. If you look at the census, 2011, and even now the caste census, of which we don't have the results, but whatever little has come out, it has a very high SC population. So can we explain the absence? One is, of course, you dispute the Partha Chatterjee. Partha Chatterjee's explanation was, the refugee experience in some ways, the caste gets sublimated in the struggle for refugees just to survive, cut off from land, etc. But there is also the other factor of, I don't know how much importance you would ascribe to that, the long, the communist rule in West Bengal, 35 years plus, where, you did mention briefly that the ideology itself wasn't particularly geared to pandering to caste sentiments, caste loyalties. That's one aspect. But there's also, besides the absence, the other aspect is the complete dominance of the upper and the middle class of West Bengal politics. How does one explain that? Again, if you look at the numbers, and considering the number of years that have now gone by, post-partition, the Motuas, as you did mention, are now political, have become politicized. But again, the movement has got fragmented under Mamata. So just your views on that.
Yeah, sorry. Excellent presentation. I enjoyed it very much because I also have experience of the other side, meaning refugees coming in from India into East Bengal, then East Bengal, later East Pakistan. Interesting point about Jagannath Mondal. Had he belonged to the Congress and provincial politics, he would have done much better. Because as far as I can recall, in 54 elections, the Congress got 28 seats in East Bengal, whereas the Muslim League got 10. You see, there are 310 seats, Muslim League got 10, the United Front got 300, and out of the 300 United Front, 28 had belonged to the Pakistan National Congress. 1954 East Bengal elections, where the Muslim League was trounced. Interesting parallel. I like that thesis of yours that Congress, the partition was an event, and it was a process, not an event, because there are other partitions to follow, 71 for instance. And sometime after effect of the partition also remained in Pakistan. This is to flag the point, because the Bihari refugees who came into East Bengal also moved to Pakistan thereafter. And today, even today in Karachi, it's a big issue, and the refugees constitute what the party of MQM, which is a very major political factor in Pakistan, and they still identify themselves as refugees. And just a final point, on this difference between the Bhadralok and the Namashudra thing that you make in, among the Hindus going across, Muslims coming on the other side, there was also this distinction, not so much in terms of caste, but the upper class Muslims and the poorer Muslims. The upper caste from the UP who came into government positions and, went into police and all that. And those who came from Bihar, who came and took over, not so much even as landowners, but they were all sharecroppers. I have a small question though. The Namashudras, were they sharecroppers or did they own land?
Fine, one more question.
Yes.
Shojan.
I guess you track of the current status of these Dalit refugees from East Bengal, and I wonder whether you find any difference between different states. I mean, different states treating these Dalit refugees, to facilitate rehabilitation. Because my guess is that some southern part of state in India may treat them differently. Like, for example, let's see Tamil Nadu. There are lots of Dalit parties which may accommodate them. At the same time, the CPI's power has been very weak. So would you find any difference?
Okay. Getting to Rananjoy's question, this people have been splitting their hair on this. Few years ago, I wrote an article with the title, "Does Caste Matter in Bengal?" where I took issue with Partha Chatterjee and others. Now, my reading of the cultural history of Bengal tells me that the Bengalis make a distinction between caste and untouchability. If you look at the Reformation, all the histories of reforms from Ram Mohan Roy to the nationalist movement, each and every reform movement is focused on untouchability. But no reform movement talks about caste system. And not just talks about caste system, some of the reform movements actually defends caste system, taking almost a Gandhian position. If you start from Vivekananda, Rabindranath, and Ram Mohan Roy, and everyone, and if you look at the Hindu revivalist movements of the 19th century, they are in fact arguing that caste system is a much more homogeneous system which is much better than conflict-ridden class system of the West. So this become an icon, a symbol of national identity, which distinguishes their modernity from the Western modernity, which is class reason, which is bad. And this permeates through the ages, through the classes. So what you find today in West Bengal is that you will not find very overt cases of untouchability. You will not find caste-based violence. So those overt cases of discrimination based on caste, which you find in North India or Western India, you will not find them in West Bengal. But what you will find them, look at the leadership structure of Congress, look at the leadership structure of CPI and CPIM, it is entirely dominated by upper caste, three upper castes Bhadralok. It is only very recently that the CPIM government took on scheduled caste as ministers. So in other words, the leadership of the even of the Communist Party was totally in the hands of the upper caste Bhadralok. After the Barga movement in West Bengal, there has been some changes in the structure of the caste composition in the leadership. In the sense that I think Rad has an article on this based on the field work in Bardwan and Birbhum, where he shows that there has been some mobility from the bottom up through the panchayat system and through the election, but this mobility goes up to a certain extent. It does not go all the way up. So there has been some changes in the power structure at the bottom, where these lower classes, the scheduled caste peasants, have been somewhat appropriated into the political structure, but it is not enough to change the entire political structure. So it's a kind of deception, I mean, this is what I have written in newspapers, and I have got hate mail for this. It is a deception on the part of Bengali Bhadralok that we say that caste does not exist in Bengal. It is very much. And Ashish Nandi has a piece where he argues that it is so much ingrained that you do not have to say this, you can feel it. So, I won't go into details, but about Tikasa, yes, the Namashudras had both sharecroppers as well as landholders, but they were small landholders. They were the peasant group which were experiencing social mobility throughout the 19th century through the reclamation of the bill areas of Faridpur, Bakarganj, Jessore, Khulna, and the reclamation of the Sundarban areas in Jessore and 24 Parganas. So through this reclamation of the marshy tracts and the forest areas, some of them were acquiring land, but not to very large extent. I mean, you won't find large landholders like Jodhars among the Namashudras. They were mainly small peasant holders, and many of them were sharecroppers. There was a major sharecroppers movement in 1918, 1920 among the Namashudras. And if you look at the Tevhaga movement's demographic composition in central Bengal, the main participants in Tevhaga movement were Namashudra peasants and Rajbongshi peasants. It was mainly the Dalit peasants who were leading the charge. And your question about other states, I mean, it's difficult to answer that question as such for me, because other states like Tamil Nadu did not have to face this problem. They did not have to rehabilitate thousands of refugees, Dalit refugees coming. But those other states like Bihar, Orissa and Assam, which did face this problem, they were even worse. And in Assam particularly, that's another case study which we will do. In Assam particularly, the treatment of these peasant refugees was even more appalling. I mean, there are stories in newspapers which shows that even they kind of put elephants to destroy the huts which these the refugees had constructed. So even they could go to that extent. Whether that was with state support or not, that we don't know. But there are stories which are even more worse. So it's difficult to say, because the southern states did not experience this problem, where thousands of people were coming and changing your demography. If that had happened, no one knows what would have happened. But those states which faced this problem, they reacted in even worse ways.
Perhaps the final question by Ambika.
Thank you very much for your paper. You mentioned that one of the reasons why caste doesn't appear in a dominant way in Bengal is because of the dispersal, after the dispersal of Dalit groups after the partition. So here is the assumption that they were consolidated before partition. It didn't come out, I don't know, maybe I didn't understand, I didn't follow. I was trying to understand before partition how consolidated the Dalit group was and what was the reason behind it, which actually after the partition it sort of broke. Because if they were very much consolidated, can dispersal, what I'm trying to say is the reason for dispersal too simplistic? Other factors, because I wanted to understand that. Second question is about the refugees. You said some went to Andamans and some went to Dandakaranya. In Andamans, you said it's a success story. I wanted to know what is it, or how did you differentiate what is success story and what is...
Okay. Very brief question by Romit. Romit, you have to be really brief.
I mean, I was wondering if you have any explanations for the absence of caste in the historiography on partition in Bengal. I mean, is it simply a story of the upper caste historian being blind to caste deprivation? Or is it a more disciplinary problem? How would you read the conditions of knowledge production which allowed this absence of discussion on caste?
Can I go back to my slide? That's a historical coincidence, you might say. That's the two groups, if you look at the history of the Dalit movement in pre-1945-46 Bengal, then this was mainly being organized in two areas, where two solid groups lived in those areas, in a very crucially, and it is also, I mean, it has a historical process, because they became socially mobile through reclamation of westlands. And those were the areas where westlands were available, the forests were available. So that was the process of their social mobility. And through that social mobility, they came up the economic ladder, and they began to have political aspirations. They began to form organizations, and the movement started. But after the partition, whereas they were living in few districts before, they were now dispersed all over India. Now I'm not suggesting for one moment that's the only reason why caste is not talked about in West Bengal. What I'm trying to say that the Dalit movements which were there, very strong Dalit movement in Bengal before 1947, after 1947 that Dalit movement just disappears. How do we explain that disappearance? The only plausible explanation could be this. The explanation is not that the caste question is resolved in West Bengal, that Dalits were well off, so they didn't have to resist. The explanation is that they are dispersed all over India, where they don't live in Bengal anymore, majority of them, main body of them. And historiography, I would not say that this is an upper caste conspiracy. But as I say that it's mainly because of the very nature of archives. And the very nature of archives comes from how the state constructed the story of partition. From 1946 onwards. From 1946 onwards, the late colonial state and following the colonial state, the independent state, constructed the story as conflict of two religious groups. And therefore, the caste as a word does not appear in the archives. I mean, I was surprised. I was looking at the 11-volume Inquiry Commission reports on the Calcutta riot of 1946. And all these 11 volumes talk about how the Bhadralok suffered, how the Hindus kind of died, how the Hindus attacked. So it's Hindu, Bhadralok. Not once in 11 volumes the word caste appears. So in other words, it's the nature of archives, but it is sad that historians for a long time got stuck by the archives. So what we try to do, we want to go beyond the official archives. And unless you go beyond the official archives, you don't get the story. So I won't say it was a conspiracy, but rather because of the nature of the archive. Have I answered you?
Yes, but isn't it strange that oral histories were being used to talk about other kinds of problems?
Not in Bengal until recently. Okay. Oral history for reconstructing partition history has been used mostly for North India. Not until I don't know of any work which has used this.
Okay. We've had a very full discussion, and I think I will request the host, Professor Mitra, to say a few words.
Unless you go behind the official archive, you will not get at the full truth. Quote unquote, this is going to be my takeaway from this paper by a distinguished historian. I suspect you'll next get us to talk about rumors and other imaginary constructions. To thank you on behalf of the South Asia Studies Program and the ISAS, we would like to give you a token which might help you go westwards. This is Pakistan, the garrison state, by one of our colleagues. And thank you very much. Wonderful talk.